My name is Thomas Balfour, and I inherited a responsibility I never asked for when my father died in March 1989. Not money, he left almost nothing. Not property, the cottage was rented, the boat barely seaworthy. What he left me was a duty that had consumed his entire adult life, a promise made to something that lived in the dark waters of Loch Ness, and a consequence I'm only now beginning to understand. My father was Angus Balfour, a man who spent 43 years feeding the creature that tourists come to photograph and locals pretend doesn't exist. Every morning at dawn, regardless of weather or season, he would take his boat out to the same spot near Foyers and throw fish into the water. Not for sport. Not for research. But as payment for something he'd never fully explained, fulfillment of a bargain he'd made long before I was born. He died at 71, his heart finally giving out after decades of early mornings and physical labor and whatever psychological burden came with being the keeper of a secret that couldn't be shared. I was 32, living in Glasgow, working as an accountant, thoroughly disconnected from my father's strange life on the loch. We'd been estranged for years. I'd left at 18, fled to the city, built a normal life away from the whispers and the strangeness and my father's obsession with something I'd never seen and didn't believe in. But when he died, when I returned to Fort William for the funeral and met with his solicitor, I discovered what he'd left me. A letter, sealed and marked for Thomas, to be opened only after my death. I'm 57 years old now, recording this testimony from a hotel room in London where I've been hiding for 3 weeks. The creature is looking for me. I know that sounds insane, sounds like the delusion of a man who's lost his grip on reality. But I've seen it. Felt it. Understood with terrible certainty that my father's death broke a contract I didn't know existed, and now something ancient and patient is coming to collect what it believes it's owed. If you're watching this, if this recording has found you somehow, then you need to understand from the start, this isn't a story about a monster. This is a story about obligation, about debts that span generations, about what happens when ancient promises are broken. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready for the truth about what my father was really doing all those years. Hit that like button if you believe some responsibilities can be inherited even when we don't want them. Share this with people who understand that running from the past doesn't work when the past can swim. The letter was written in my father's careful hand, dated 2 weeks before his death. Thomas, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're angry. Angry that I left you this burden. Angry that I never explained while I was alive. Angry that I'm forcing you to make a choice I had no right to force on you. I'm sorry. But I have no choice. The contract must be maintained. The feeding must continue. If it stops, if the creature goes unfed for more than 3 days, it will come looking. And when it comes looking, it doesn't understand excuses or refusals. It only understands the terms of the agreement made by my grandfather in 1903. I've fed it every morning for 43 years. I've kept the promise. I've maintained the peace. Now that duty falls to you, whether you want it or not. Because the alternative is worse than you can imagine. Go to my cottage. In the kitchen cupboard, behind the flour tin, you'll find detailed instructions. Times. Locations. The specific fish it prefers. The signals it responds to. Everything you need to continue what I started. Or don't. Refuse the duty. Go back to your life in Glasgow. But know that if you do, if you let the feeding lapse, it will find you. Not immediately, but eventually. And it will demand what it's owed. I love you, son. I'm sorry this is my legacy to you. Your father Angus Balfour. I should have ignored it. Should have dismissed it as the final delusion of a man who'd spent too many years alone on the water, who'd built his entire life around a fantasy that gave meaning to an otherwise unremarkable existence. Should have gone back to Glasgow and forgotten about letters and duties and creatures that didn't exist. Instead, 3 days after the funeral, I found myself standing in my father's cottage, pulling a flower tin from the cupboard, discovering the detailed journal he'd kept for over 4 decades. The journal was leather-bound, thick with entries in my father's handwriting spanning from 1946 to just weeks before his death. The early entries were brief, clinical. May 3rd, 1946. First feeding. 20 pounds of herring. Creature surfaced at 6:17 a.m. Took all fish. No sign of distress or aggression. May 4th, 1946. Second feeding. Same amount. Creature surfaced at 6:15 a.m. Pattern seems established. But as the years progressed, the entries became more detailed, more personal. My father had been documenting not just feeding times but observations, behaviors, what seemed like attempts to understand the creature beyond mere routine. August 12, 1958. Creature surfaced earlier than usual, appeared agitated. Water temperature has risen significantly this summer. Increased feeding amount by 10 pounds. It accepted gratefully, or so it seemed. Hard to read emotion in something so alien, but I swear it recognized the extra effort. December 3rd, 1967. Terrible storm last night. Couldn't make the feeding this morning until nearly noon. Creature was waiting at the spot, visibly distressed. It made sounds I hadn't heard before, almost like reproach. I apologized. Out loud. To a creature in a loch. My father would have said I've gone mad. Perhaps I have. And then, scattered throughout the later years, entries that suggested something I hadn't expected. June 18, 1973. Thomas turned 16 today. I wanted to tell him about the duty, prepare him for what will eventually fall to him. But how do you explain to a son that you've been feeding a creature most people think is a hoax? That you've built your entire life around maintaining a contract your grandfather made with something that shouldn't exist? I kept silent. Let him think I'm just a fisherman with strange habits. Maybe that's kinder than the truth. November 7th, 1982. Thomas left for university today. Told me he never wants to come back to this backwards place with its superstitious nonsense. He's ashamed of me, of what I do, of the life I've chosen. I should be hurt, but mostly I'm relieved. Maybe he can escape this. Maybe the duty can die with me. But I know better. The creature remembers. It will remember him. It will expect him to continue when I'm gone. Reading those entries, seeing my father's awareness of my contempt, his hope that I could escape, his certainty that I couldn't, filled me with a guilt that sat like stone in my stomach. I judged him, mocked him, dismissed his entire life as wasted on delusion. And all the while, he'd been protecting me from knowledge that would have forced me to share his burden. The final entry was dated 3 days before he died. March 11th, 1989. The pain is getting worse. Doctor says my heart won't last much longer. I've tried to prepare for what comes after. Left Thomas the letter. Left him this journal. Left him everything he needs to continue the feeding. But I know my son. He'll refuse. He'll think this is madness. And the creature will come for him. Will demand what it's owed. I pray Thomas is stronger than I think he is. Smarter. Wiser. Because if he isn't, if he can't maintain the contract, God help him. I sat in my father's cottage, reading his journal by lamplight, trying to convince myself it was fiction. Trying to rationalize how a sane man could spend 43 years feeding something that didn't exist. Trying to find the explanation that would let me dismiss all of this and return to my normal life. But I couldn't. Because beneath the journal, wrapped in oilcloth, was a photograph. Old, faded, dated 1903 on the back. It showed 3 men standing on a dock, my great-grandfather among them, and in the water beside the dock, clearly visible even in the grainy black and white image, was the unmistakable shape of something large and serpentine. The creature was real. My father hadn't been delusional. And I had inherited a duty I had no idea how to fulfill. I should have started immediately. Should have followed my father's instructions, gone to the spot he'd marked on the map, thrown fish into the water at dawn like he'd done for 43 years. But I couldn't. The whole thing felt absurd, like participating in an elaborate joke I didn't understand. So I didn't feed it. For 4 days after finding the journal, I stayed in my father's cottage, reading and rereading his entries, trying to make sense of a life spent in service to something impossible. Trying to decide whether I was obligated to continue something I'd never agreed to. On the 5th morning, I woke to a sound I'd never heard before. Low, resonant, vibrating through the walls of the cottage. Not loud, exactly, but penetrating, the kind of sound you feel in your bones rather than hear with your ears. I went to the window. Dawn was just breaking, grey light spreading across the loch. And there, perhaps 50 meters from shore, directly in front of my father's cottage, was the creature. The neck rose from the water, 3 meters, maybe 4, a dark and massive, water streaming off skin that looked almost black in the early morning light. The head was smaller than I'd expected, narrow and streamlined, with eyes that I couldn't see clearly at this distance but that I felt watching me with unmistakable intensity. It made the sound again. That deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly to something primal in my brain. And I understood, without knowing how I understood, what it was saying. Where is he? Where is the man who feeds me? Where is my agreement? I stood at the window, frozen, my rational mind insisting this couldn't be happening while my body responded with pure, instinctive terror. The creature waited. Patient. Expectant. After perhaps 2 minutes, it sank slowly beneath the surface and disappeared. But I knew it hadn't gone far. Knew it was waiting. Knew that my father's warning had been absolutely accurate. The feeding must continue, or the creature would come looking. I found the fish my father had kept, stored in a freezer in the shed behind the cottage, carefully portioned and dated. 20 pounds of herring, exactly as the journal had specified. I loaded them into my father's boat, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped the bucket twice. The morning was calm, the loch like glass. I motored to the spot my father had marked on his map, a location perhaps 2 kilometers from shore, in deep water, distinguished by landmarks on the hills that I'd never have noticed if the map hadn't pointed them out. I cut the engine and waited. The silence was absolute. No birds. No wind. Just me and the dark water and the knowledge that something was beneath me, waiting to see if I would fulfill the obligation I'd inherited. I threw the first fish into the water. It sank quickly, disappearing into the depths. Nothing happened. I threw a second fish, then a third, then a fourth, my movements becoming more mechanical, more desperate with each throw. On the 10th fish, the water moved. Stop here. Right here. This is the moment I became my father's son, whether I wanted to or not. The moment I understood that some legacies can't be refused, some duties can't be escaped, some contracts endure beyond death. Subscribe if you want to know what happened when I finally completed my first feeding. Hit that like button if you believe obligations can be inherited through blood. Because what the creature showed me that morning proved my father had been protecting me from knowledge far stranger and more terrifying than I'd ever imagined. The creature rose slowly, emerging from the depths with that same patient grace I'd seen from my father's cottage. But this time I was close. Close enough to see details. Close enough to understand why my father had spent 43 years maintaining this ritual. The eyes were what destroyed any remaining skepticism. Large, forward-facing, dark and liquid and filled with intelligence that made my breath catch. This wasn't an animal. Not in any simple sense. This was something that knew. That remembered. That recognized the difference between my father and me and was making a judgment about whether I was an acceptable substitute. It took the remaining fish. Not greedily, not frantically, but with deliberate selection, taking them from the water one by one, as if assessing quality, as if demonstrating that this wasn't mere feeding but a transaction with standards and expectations. When all the fish were gone, the creature held position beside my boat. We looked at each other across 3 meters of space and an unbridgeable gulf of biology and evolution. And I felt something pass between us. Not communication, exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition. The creature accepting that I would continue what my father had started, and me accepting that I had no choice. Then it dove. Smoothly, silently, disappearing into the depths and leaving me alone in my father's boat, understanding finally what his life had been about. I stayed in Scotland for 3 weeks after that first feeding. Continued the ritual every morning, learning the patterns my father had documented, understanding through repetition what his journal had tried to convey. The creature responded to consistency, to punctuality, to respect demonstrated through careful adherence to the terms it expected. But I also discovered something my father's journal hadn't fully explained. The feeding wasn't just about sustenance. The creature could clearly hunt for itself. I'd seen it take fish from the loch when I arrived at the feeding spot earlier than usual. The ritual was about something else. Something closer to recognition than nutrition. My father had been providing acknowledgement, proving through daily effort that he remembered the contract, respected the terms, honored the agreement made by his grandfather 86 years earlier. The creature wasn't being fed. It was being remembered. And that remembering was what it demanded in exchange for what? Peace? Non-interference? Permission to exist in waters increasingly dominated by human activity. I found my great-grandfather's diary in my father's cottage during the 2nd week. It had been stored in a lockbox under the floorboards, protected from moisture and time, documenting the original contract. September 14, 1903. Made contact with the creature today. It's been taking fish from our nets for weeks, threatening our livelihood. But rather than hunt it or drive it away, I made a proposal. Daily feeding in exchange for leaving our catches alone. It seemed to understand. Remarkable. Terrifying. But practical. This arrangement benefits both species. September 15, 1903. Second feeding. The creature appeared at the same time as yesterday. Pattern established. I believe it's intelligent enough to remember to honor agreements. This could work. This could keep the peace. September 30th, 1903. 2 weeks of successful feeding. It's important, I told him. More important than you understand. Don't miss a day. Don't be late. The timing matters. He looked at me the way I'd once looked at my father, with pity for a man who'd let obsession override reason. But he took the money and promised to maintain the feeding while I was gone. I returned to Glasgow. Tried to resume my life. Went to work, paid bills, maintained the routine of a normal existence. But I couldn't stop thinking about the creature. About my father. About the journal entries describing 43 years of dawn feedings and patient obligation. About whether I would end up the same way, trapped by a duty I'd never chosen, unable to escape even if I wanted to. 2 months later, I received a call from the man I'd hired. His voice was shaking. I can't do this anymore. I went out this morning, and it came up right beside the boat. Looked at me. Mr. Balfour, that thing is huge. And it's smart. I could see it in its eyes, it knew I wasn't you. Knew I was a substitute. It took the fish, but I swear it was angry about it. I'm not going back out there. Find someone else. He hung up before I could respond. And I understood with sinking certainty that the creature wouldn't accept a substitute indefinitely. That it expected me. That the contract was personal in ways I'd failed to appreciate. I tried to hire others. Posted advertisements for boat work that carefully avoided mentioning what the work actually involved. Found a few willing to try. None lasted more than a week before calling me with variations of the same message. The creature was rejecting them, was showing signs of distress or aggression, was making it clear that only I was acceptable. My father had known this would happen. Had tried to warn me in his letter. The feeding must be done by family. By the line that had made the original contract. Substitutes could maintain the routine for a short time, but eventually, the creature would demand the genuine article. After 3 months of failed substitutes, I received something that made my blood run cold. A package arrived at my flat in Glasgow, no return address, containing a photograph. The photograph showed me standing at my window in my flat. Taken with a telephoto lens from somewhere nearby, in the past few days based on what I'd been wearing. And written on the back in handwriting I didn't recognize. The creature is looking for you. It's learning where you live. How long do you think you can ignore what your father maintained for 43 years? Go back. Feed it. Honor the contract. Or accept what comes when ancient agreements are broken. Someone else knew about the creature. Someone else was monitoring the situation. And they were making it clear that running from this duty wasn't an option. Part 2 will reveal who was watching, what they wanted, and what happened when I finally returned to Loch Ness to face a responsibility I'd been trying to escape for months. I returned to Scotland 2 days after receiving the photograph. Told my employer I needed extended leave for family matters. Packed a bag with enough clothes for a month. Drove north through rain and grey skies, each kilometre bringing me closer to a duty I'd been trying to escape and a creature that had apparently decided I couldn't. My father's cottage was exactly as I'd left it 3 months earlier. Cold, damp, filled with the accumulated possessions of a man who'd lived alone for decades. I made a fire, unpacked, tried to settle into the reality that this was my life now. That I would become my father, isolated, obsessed, trapped by an obligation made before I was born. The next morning at dawn, I took the boat out. The loch was calm, the water reflecting grey clouds like a mirror. I motored to the feeding spot, my hand steady on the wheel despite the dread sitting like ice in my stomach. Cut the engine. Prepared the fish. Waited. The creature appeared within minutes. Rose from the depths with that familiar smooth grace, positioning itself beside the boat exactly as it had done during those 3 weeks when I'd been learning the routine. But something was different. The way it looked at me carried weight I hadn't felt before. Judgment, maybe. Or relief. Or something I lacked the framework to interpret. I threw the fish. It took them, one by one, its movements conveying acceptance. When the last fish was gone, it stayed beside the boat longer than usual. Made a sound, that low, resonant thrumming, that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple acknowledgement. Then it did something my father's journal had never mentioned. It moved closer. Close enough that I could have reached out and touched it if I'd been brave or foolish enough. Close enough that I could see my reflection in its dark eyes. Close enough that I felt something pass between us that wasn't quite communication but wasn't quite nothing either. Understanding, maybe. The creature recognizing that I'd returned not because I wanted to but because I had no choice. And somehow, impossibly, that seemed to matter to it. Seemed to create a connection beyond mere routine. It descended slowly, leaving me alone in the boat with the growing certainty that I'd just accepted a role I would never be able to leave. The man who'd sent the photograph made contact 3 days later. I was at the cottage when I heard a car on the access road, unusual, since few people had reason to come this far from the main highway. A black sedan, expensive, driven by someone who clearly didn't belong in the Scottish Highlands. The driver was perhaps 50, wearing clothes that marked him as professional, urban, completely out of place against the backdrop of hills and water. He introduced himself as Dr. Martin Webb, though whether that was his real name I never learned. Mr. Balfour. Thank you for returning. We were concerned you might refuse the responsibility. We? An organization that's been monitoring the situation at Loch Ness for considerably longer than your family has been feeding the creature. We're pleased you've chosen to honor the contract. You're the one who sent the photograph. We wanted to ensure you understood the stakes. Understood that this isn't a duty you can simply walk away from. The creature has expectations. Breaking those expectations would have consequences. Consequences for whom? Dr. Webb smiled without warmth. For everyone involved. The creature. You. Anyone who happens to be on or near the loch when it decides to express its displeasure at being neglected. Your father understood this. Maintained the feeding for 43 years without fail. We hoped you would demonstrate the same commitment. What is your organization? Why are you watching this? We're custodians, Mr. Balfour. We maintain the balance between human activity and phenomena that most people don't believe exist. The creature in Loch Ness is one such phenomenon. Your family's contract with it is another. Both require careful management to ensure the situation remains stable. Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. This wasn't just about my family and a creature. There was an entire organization, possibly governmental, possibly private, I never learned which, that had been monitoring the feeding for decades. They knew about the contract, knew about my father, and they were making it clear that I had no choice but to continue. Subscribe if you want to understand how deep this conspiracy goes. Hit that like button if you believe some secrets are maintained by organizations with resources we can't imagine. Because what Dr. Webb told me next explained why my father had never tried to escape and why I wouldn't be able to either. What happens if I refuse? I asked. What if I just stop feeding it? The creature becomes agitated, surfaces more frequently, takes more risks. Eventually, someone captures clear footage or photographs. The secret becomes public. And then, he shrugged. Then the creature either dies from the attention or disappears into depths we can't reach. Either way, the situation becomes unmanageable. Better for everyone if the feeding continues. So you're not protecting the creature. You're protecting the secret. We're protecting stability. The creature benefits from remaining hidden. Humanity benefits from not having to acknowledge its existence. Your family benefits from maintaining a tradition that gives your lives meaning and purpose. Everyone wins if the arrangement continues. And if I still refuse, then we find other ways to ensure your cooperation. Ways that are less pleasant than a simple conversation. Your father never forced us to those measures. We hope you won't either. It was the most polite threat I'd ever received. And the most effective. Because I understood that Dr. Webb's organization, whatever it was, had resources my father and I could never match. If they wanted me to continue the feeding, they would make sure I continued it, whether I agreed willingly or not. What do you want from me? I asked. Exactly what your father did. Daily feeding. Detailed records. Notification if anything changes, if the creature's behavior shifts, if its health appears to deteriorate, if it shows signs of distress or aggression. In exchange, we leave you alone. Provide financial support if needed. Ensure that you can maintain this duty without hardship. Financial support. Your father received a monthly stipend from us. Enough to cover expenses, maintain his boat and equipment, live modestly. He never told you because he wanted to protect you from knowledge that would obligate you. But now that you've accepted the responsibility, you're entitled to the same arrangement. It made terrible sense. My father had never seemed to struggle financially despite having no apparent income beyond occasional odd jobs. He'd maintained his boat, bought fish, lived comfortably enough. I'd assumed he had savings or a pension. But it had been Dr. Webb's organization all along, paying him to maintain a contract that served their purposes. I'll continue the feeding, I said. But I want answers. I want to know what this organization is, why you care so much about one creature in a Scottish loch, what you're really protecting. Those answers aren't part of our arrangement, Mr. Balfour. You feed the creature? We ensure you can do so without interference. That's the extent of our relationship. Asking for more will only complicate things unnecessarily. He left then, driving away in his expensive sedan, leaving me with more questions than answers and the growing certainty that I'd become part of something far larger and stranger than a simple feeding arrangement. Over the following months, I fell into the routine my father had maintained for 4 decades. Up at dawn, regardless of weather. Out to the feeding spot. Fish thrown into the water. The creature surfacing, taking its payment, descending again. Day after day, week after week, the ritual consuming my life the way it had consumed my father's. But something was changing. The creature was responding to me differently than it had during those first weeks. Coming closer. Staying longer. Making sounds I'd never heard during my initial attempts at feeding. As if it was testing me, evaluating whether I could be trusted the way my father had been trusted. I started keeping my own journal, documenting observations my father's entries hadn't prepared me for. The creature had moods, preferences, days when it was more interactive and days when it took the fish quickly and left. It responded to my tone of voice, not understanding words, but recognizing intention, emotion, the difference between reluctant obligation and genuine engagement. And slowly, against my will and my intention, I began to understand what had kept my father here all those years. This wasn't just a duty. It was a relationship. Strange, impossible, crossing every boundary between species, but a relationship nonetheless. The creature recognized me, remembered me, responded to me as an individual rather than simply a source of food. One morning in July, 6 months after I'd returned, the creature did something extraordinary. After taking all the fish, instead of descending immediately, it circled my boat. Slowly, deliberately, as if examining me from different angles. Then it made a sound I'd never heard, higher pitched than the usual thrumming, almost melodic. And in response to that sound, 2 smaller creatures surfaced perhaps 30 meters away. Juveniles. Offspring. Young ones that had been hidden from me until the primary creature, the one my family had been feeding since 1903, decided I could be trusted with knowledge of their existence. I sat in my boat, watching these 3 creatures together, understanding finally what my father had been protecting. Not just one individual but a family. A bloodline that had survived in these waters for generations, maybe centuries, because humans like my great-grandfather had recognized that cooperation was better than conflict. The adult creature looked at me, and I felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. It was showing me its children. Trusting me with the knowledge that it wasn't alone, that the contract wasn't just about feeding one creature but about protecting a small population that depended on human discretion for survival. I understand, I said aloud, my voice rough with emotion. I'll protect them. All of them. I promise. The creature made that melodic sound again, then descended. The juveniles followed. And I was alone on the water, understanding that I'd just accepted a responsibility far greater than I'd imagined. The crisis came in November, during a storm that hit the Highlands with unusual ferocity. Wind strong enough to tear branches from trees. Rain that turned the loch from black glass to churning chaos. I'd planned to skip the feeding. Surely the creature would understand that going out in these conditions was impossible. But at dawn, I heard the sound. That low, resonant thrumming, audible even over the wind. Coming from the direction of the loch. Insistent. Urgent. Different from the usual morning acknowledgement. Something was wrong. I struggled into my weather gear and made my way to the dock. The boat was there, tied securely, bucking in the waves. Taking it out in these conditions was suicide. But the sound continued, growing more urgent, and I understood that the creature was calling for help. I loaded the fish, my hands nearly frozen by wind and rain, and pushed the boat into the water. The crossing to the feeding spot should have taken 10 minutes. It took nearly 40, the boat pitching and rolling, water slamming over the bow, every moment a battle against waves that wanted to capsize me. When I finally reached the location, cutting the engine and trying to hold position, the creature surfaced immediately. But it wasn't alone. One of the juveniles was with it, and the juvenile was in distress, tangled in what looked like fishing net, the mesh cutting into its neck and flippers, restricting movement, clearly causing pain. The adult creature looked at me with unmistakable desperation. It had brought its injured offspring to the one place it associated with human assistance. To the spot where, for 86 years, humans had demonstrated benevolence. It was asking for help in the only way it knew how. This is the moment everything changed. The moment I stopped being just someone maintaining a duty and became something else, someone the creature trusted not just to feed it but to help it. Subscribe if you want to know what I did next. Hit that like button if you believe trust between species is earned through action, not intention. Because what happened in the next 10 minutes proved that my father's 43 years of consistent care had built something remarkable, a bond strong enough that when crisis came, the creature turned to us rather than fleeing. I had no tools for cutting net. Nothing aboard the boat that could help. But I understood that doing nothing wasn't an option. That the creature had come to me because it believed I could help, and failing to try would break more than just the feeding contract. I grabbed my fishing knife, small, barely adequate, and did something insane. I stripped off my weather gear and dove into the freezing, storm-tossed water. The cold was a physical shock, painful enough to make me gasp and nearly lose the knife. But I kicked toward the juvenile creature, toward the net that was strangling it, toward a situation where I could easily die trying to help something most people didn't believe existed. The adult creature watched, holding position, its eyes tracking my movements. The juvenile was panicking, thrashing, making the situation worse. But as I got closer, as it saw me with the knife, it went still. As if it understood. As if it recognized that I was trying to help rather than harm. I started cutting the net. The knife was dull, the mesh was thick, and my hands were so cold I could barely grip anything. But I cut. And cut. And cut. Freeing the juvenile's neck first, then its flippers, removing the tangled mesh piece by piece until the creature could move freely again. The whole process took perhaps 5 minutes. It felt like hours. By the time I finished, I was shaking so badly from cold I wasn't sure I could swim back to the boat. The juvenile creature, freed from the net, dove immediately. The adult stayed beside me, its massive presence in the water both terrifying and oddly comforting. And then it did something I still can't fully explain. It moved beneath me, rising until I was partially supported by its body, and pushed me toward my boat. Not roughly, not aggressively, but with clear intent, helping me back to safety the way I'd helped its offspring. I grabbed the side of the boat and pulled myself aboard, collapsing in the bottom, too cold to do anything but shake and gasp. The creature surfaced one more time, made a sound that seemed to carry gratitude or acknowledgement or something I had no framework for interpreting. Then it descended, leaving me alone in the storm. I made it back to shore. Somehow. Got inside the cottage. Stripped off wet clothes and huddled by the fire until warmth returned and I could think clearly again. And I understood, finally, what my father had meant when he'd said in his journal that he'd built his entire life around this duty. Because saving the juvenile creature, feeling the adult's gratitude, understanding the trust that had been placed in me, that was worth more than any career, any normal life, any conventional measure of success. We've been maintaining the feeding for 35 years now. I'm 67 years old, recording this from my father's cottage, my cottage now, knowing that my time is running short. The same heart condition that killed my father is starting to manifest in me. Chest pains. Shortness of breath. The doctor in Fort William gives me perhaps 5 years if I'm lucky. Which means I need to find my successor. Need to pass this duty to someone who will honor it the way my father did, the way I've tried to do. But I have no children. No siblings. No family line to continue what my great-grandfather started in 1903. Dr. Webb, or whoever he really was, died years ago. His organization still exists, still monitors the situation, still provides the monthly stipend. But they've made it clear that if I can't find a successor from my family, they'll make other arrangements. What those arrangements are, they won't say. And I'm terrified that other arrangements means the feeding ends when I die. The creatures, I know there are at least 5 now, maybe more hiding in the deep water, have become part of my life in ways I never expected. I know them as individuals. Know their personalities, their preferences, their moods. The juvenile I saved in 1989 is an adult now, with offspring of its own. The lineage continues, hidden in the deep water, surviving because of a contract my great-grandfather made and my family has honored for over a century. But what happens when I'm gone? When there's no one to maintain the daily feeding, the consistent presence, the recognition that these creatures have come to depend on? Will they survive? Will they find other food sources? Or will they emerge more frequently, take more risks, eventually expose themselves in ways that lead to their destruction? I don't know. And that uncertainty keeps me awake at night, makes me lie in the darkness wondering if I've failed them by not having children, by not ensuring the duty could continue beyond my generation. This is Thomas Balfour's testimony. Recorded in Fort William, Scotland, in December 2024. I'm releasing this not to prove anything. I have no footage, no photographs, nothing that would convince skeptics. But to bear witness. To say, my family made a promise in 1903, and we've kept it for 121 years. The creatures in Loch Ness are real. They're intelligent enough to remember individuals across decades. They're trusting enough to seek help from humans when they're in distress. They're worthy of the protection my family has provided. And they're in danger now. Because I'm dying, and I don't know who will continue the feeding when I'm gone. Subscribe to this channel if you believe some responsibilities transcend individual lives. Hit that like button if you think contracts made by our ancestors still have meaning. Share this with anyone who might understand what it means to inherit a duty you never asked for but can't refuse. My father fed the Loch Ness Monster for decades. Now the creature is looking for me, and not with aggression, but with expectation. With trust. With the belief that I'll honor the agreement the way my father did, the way his father did, the way his grandfather did. I've tried. God knows I've tried. For 35 years, I've maintained the feeding. Kept the promise. Protected the creatures. But I'm running out of time. If you're hearing this, if you're someone who might be willing to take on this duty, contact the address I'm including with this recording. The organization that's been monitoring this situation can arrange things. Can teach you the routine. Can help you understand what you're committing to. But know this, it will consume your life. It will isolate you. It will make you question everything you thought you knew about duty and obligation and what it means to honor a promise. And despite all that, it will be worth it. Because these creatures are remarkable. Ancient. Intelligent. Worthy of protection. My father understood that. Spent 43 years proving it. I've spent 35 years learning it. And now I'm asking someone else to continue it. Because some duties are bigger than one person. Some contracts outlast the people who make them. Some promises, once made, echo across generations until someone is brave enough or foolish enough to honor them. My father fed the Loch Ness Monster for decades. Now the creature is looking for me. And soon, it will be looking for whoever comes after me. Will that be you? Thomas Balfour died on February 3, 2025. This recording was found on his computer along with detailed instructions for maintaining the feeding, maps of the loch, and over 30 years of journal entries documenting his observations of the creatures. The organization mentioned in his testimony made contact with several potential successors. As of this writing, the feeding has continued without interruption. The contract made in 1903 endures. The creatures remain hidden, and the duty passes to a fifth generation. Some responsibilities, once accepted, can never be truly abandoned. Some promises, once made, demand to be kept. No matter the cost. No matter how many generations it takes. The creatures remember. And they expect us to remember too.